Between silent tears and a devastated heart, a woman sees her marriage crumble at the exact moment she carries within her the most transformative news of her life. Without scandals, without begging, and without revealing the secret that could change everything, she chooses to walk out the door with her dignity wounded, but with a strength she didn't even know she possessed. Away from luxury, betrayal, and broken promises, the pain of divorce begins to make space for an unexpected new beginning, where love stops being a prison and starts being a shelter. And when the past decides to return to claim space precisely at the height of her pregnancy, she is no longer the woman who was abandoned, but someone ready to firmly defend everything that now has value. Now tell me, would you have the courage to leave without looking back? Then subscribe to the channel and come discover this moving story of overcoming, motherhood, and rebirth. The office on the 18th floor had glass walls that let in the entire sunset, tinting everything orange and gold. Natalia Asunção always thought that view was beautiful. On that May afternoon, she found it suffocating. She had arrived at Rodrigo's office at 6 o'clock, as he had requested by message. A message that said only, "I need to talk to you in person. Can you come here at 6? Without a question mark, without emoticons, without the way he used to write when he was in a good mood. She had reread that sentence 4 times in the bathroom of her own office before replying yes. And she already knew, with that silent certainty the body has before the mind wants to admit it, that the conversation was not about vacations or the weekend. Her husband, Rodrigo Cavalcanti, stood in front of the window while he spoke. He didn't look at her. His shoulders were straight, his fists clenched behind his back, as if he were presenting results from a board meeting and not shattering 5 years of marriage with cold and calculated words. "It doesn't work between us anymore, Natalia. I'm not happy. I need to be honest." She was sitting in the beige leather armchair he had bought on a trip to Italy. She remembered the day it arrived assembled, how they both laughed because there were screws left over, and the technician promised it was normal. Now she used the backrest as support for her hands, which were trembling discreetly in her lap. "There is someone else," he said, without turning around. The room fell into absolute silence. Outside, São Paulo remained indifferent. Horns, helicopters, the enormous and pitiless life of the metropolis that never stops. Inside here, time had stopped. Natalia opened her mouth and closed it, opened it again. No sound came out. Rodrigo finally turned around. He had the face of someone who expected an explosion and was prepared for it. His jaw was firm, his eyes cold behind black-rimmed glasses. She knew that expression. It was the face he used in difficult negotiations, when he had already decided and only waited for the other side to accept. "The papers are already ready. My lawyer has contacted yours. We want it to be fast and without drama." He slid an envelope across the mahogany desk. She looked at the envelope without touching it. There was something Rodrigo didn't know. Something she had discovered 3 weeks earlier in a hotel bathroom during a work trip, looking at a positive test with hands that couldn't stop shaking. Something she hadn't yet found the right moment to tell, and which had now become the heaviest secret in the world. She was pregnant. The word pulsed inside her like a second heart. Pregnant. And there he was, elegant and calculated, handing over divorce papers as if handing over a tax report. For a second she thought about speaking. The words even reached her throat. "Rodrigo, I need to tell you something." But then she looked into his eyes. Cold, decided, already somewhere else, with someone else, in another life. And she understood, with a clarity that hurt more than any scream, that saying it there would be pleading. It would be using the child as an argument. It would be humiliating herself in the deepest way possible. Natalia Asunção was not going to beg for any man's love. She took the envelope. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she said in a voice she didn't even recognize because it was so serene, "All right." Rodrigo blinked. It was evident he didn't expect that. "All right," he repeated. "You heard me." She stood up, put the envelope in her bag, and straightened her coat. "I'll need a few days to organize my things at the apartment." He stood still, not knowing what to do with that calmness. She walked to the door, stopped with her hand on the knob, and looked back one last time. The view of São Paulo was still there, orange and indifferent. "Rodrigo," she said, I hope you are truly happy." And she left. In the office corridor, she walked with firm steps to the executive bathroom at the end of the floor. She locked the door, sat on the cold marble floor, and stayed like that for 20 minutes, with her hands flat over her belly, breathing slowly. She didn't cry. Not yet. There was something that needed to be done before the tears. When she left the bathroom, her face was washed and her eyes were dry. The receptionist at Rodrigo's office greeted her with a smile, knowing nothing. Natalia smiled back. The city outside was bright with movement and haste. She walked for 20 minutes without a destination, letting her heels click on the asphalt while she tried to order her thoughts. 5 years. They had met at a lecture on the financial market. She as the legal advisor for a competing company. He as the investment director of Cavalcanti Holdings. He had been irresistible, confident, intelligent, elegant, and she had believed that confidence was solidity. It took time to understand it was just a shell. When she arrived in front of a pharmacy, she stopped. She looked at the window without seeing anything. Then she went in, walked to the back section almost without realizing it, and came out with a small paper bag. Inside it was a small pair of baby shoes, white, tiny, with satin bows. She didn't know why she had bought them, but when she held them in her hands there on the sidewalk, she understood it was her body's way of saying, "This is real. This is yours. This is something no one will take from you." The decision formed right there on that noisy São Paulo sidewalk, with the little shoes in her hand and the sun setting behind the skyscrapers. She wouldn't stay. She wouldn't wait for the arguments, the lawyers, the pitying looks from mutual acquaintances. The apartment split in half into inventory items. She wouldn't give Rodrigo the satisfaction of seeing how much he had hurt her. She would leave. That night, while Rodrigo was at a dinner she pretended not to know was with the other woman, Natalia filled a suitcase with the essentials: practical clothes, documents, her notebook, the small book where she kept important addresses. On the bed, she left her wedding ring. On top of the ring, she left the envelope with the divorce papers, untouched. She took her cell phone, blocked notifications, and called a taxi. She walked through the apartment one last time before leaving. She passed through the living room with the bookshelf of books she never read, because there was no time. Through the kitchen where they had cooked together, perhaps 3 times in 5 years. Through the small office where she worked late while he went out. It was a beautiful apartment, expensive, well decorated. It was an apartment that had never completely been a home. She only understood that now, at the moment of leaving it. As the car crossed the illuminated city, she opened the map and looked for a name she hadn't thought of in years. Valeria Drummond, her mother's distant cousin, who lived in a small mountain town called Gonçalves in the south of Minas Gerais. They had met twice in their lives, but Valeria had left a simple note at their grandmother's wake. "If one day you need silence, my house has space." Natalia didn't know if the note was still valid, but it was the only place in the world where Rodrigo Cavalcanti would never think to look for her. She typed a short message. "Valeria, it's Natalia. You said your house had space. I need silence. Can I come?" The reply came before the taxi reached the bus station. "You can come. I will leave the light on." That simple sentence was what stopped the tears for good. Natalia closed her phone, hugged her bag in her lap, and looked through the taxi window at the city that had been her life for 5 years. São Paulo passed by fast, enormous, indifferent. She let it pass. The bus arrived in Gonçalves early in the morning, when the fog still covered the mountains like a thick blanket, and the air had that damp cold that slowly penetrates the bones. Natalia got off with her suitcase and stood at the stop, looking around. The town was small. A central square with a small stone church, some shops still closed, a bar with plastic chairs turned inward. A dog slept on the step of a pharmacy. An old man passed slowly with a bag of fresh bread, greeting the void with a good morning to no one in particular. It was the exact opposite of São Paulo. Valeria Drummond appeared before Natalia finished orienting herself. She must have been about 60, white hair tied in a loose bun, a floral apron over a cold-weather blouse, worn leather sandals. She had the face of someone who spent her life in the sun and wind of the mountains and became more beautiful because of it. "You look just like your mother when she was young," Valeria said, and hugged her without ceremony, as if they hugged every week. Natalia sank into that hug more than she intended. She had to bite the inside of her cheek not to cry right there at the bus stop. Valeria's house was on a dirt road 10 minutes' walk from the square. It was a simple construction, made of exposed brick with a lush and messy garden that smelled of rosemary and jasmine mixed together. Inside there was a wood stove, dark wood floors, and windows that let in the whole mountain. In the back bedroom, the bed had a crochet duvet and a citronella candle on the nightstand. The walls had photos in wooden frames, a young Valeria at a country party, Valeria with someone who must have been her mother, a mountain landscape taken from a high point Natalia didn't know yet. There was an orange cat sleeping on a chair by the window that didn't even lift its head when she entered, and that animal's sovereign indifference was the most welcoming thing she had felt in days. The world didn't need to stop for her arrival. "There isn't much here," Valeria said while serving coffee, "but there is plenty of silence." "It's exactly what I need," Natalia replied. Valeria didn't ask questions on that first day, nor on the second. There was a natural wisdom in her, the wisdom of someone who understands that certain stories need time to come out. Natalia slept 12 hours straight the first night, woke up to the sound of birds and lay looking at the wooden ceiling for an hour before getting up, simply because she could. In São Paulo, she didn't remember the last time she had woken up without an alarm. In the first few days, she spoke little. She helped Valeria with household chores, learned to light the wood stove without burning herself, discovered the names of the herbs growing in the garden. Her body began to slow down in ways she didn't expect. Her shoulders dropped, her jaw relaxed, her breathing became deeper. It was as if the small town was slowly disarming something she had tensioned for years without realizing it. The pregnancy, however, reminded her of itself regularly. Nausea appeared in the morning, discreet but insistent. Valeria noticed it on the third day when Natalia refused coffee and turned pale in front of the cheese bread. The old woman said nothing at the time. Later, when they were washing dishes together, she spoke without looking at her niece. "I have ginger tea with lemon that helps a lot in the beginning." Natalia stopped with the cup in her hand. She looked at Valeria. The woman continued washing dishes with the same calmness as always. "I haven't told anyone yet," Natalia said. "You don't need to tell anyone but yourself, for now." Valeria dried her hands on her apron. "But the tea is on the bottom shelf whenever you want it." It was then that Natalia cried for the first time since she had left São Paulo. A specific and unexpected thing, that someone knew, that someone didn't judge, that someone simply put the tea on the shelf. Valeria hugged her again in the middle of the kitchen, smelling of rosemary, and let her cry it all out. With the passing weeks, Gonçalves revealed its rhythms. The open-air market took place on Fridays in the central square, with stalls of fruit, artisanal cheeses, honey, cornbread, and flowers. Natalia went for the first time on a June morning, wrapped in a thick coat she had bought in one of the square's shops, her hair tied in a quick bun. She was almost 3 months pregnant, and her belly wasn't showing yet, but she felt a presence inside her coat that still surprised her every morning. The market had a good smell. Freshly brewed coffee, fresh Minas cheese, ripe fruit. People greeted each other by name, asked about family, discussed the price of tomatoes with the familiarity of neighbors. For Natalia, accustomed to the fierce anonymity of São Paulo, it was almost surreal. In São Paulo, she had lived for years 300 meters from a bakery without ever knowing the owner's name. Here, in less than a week, she already knew that the owner of the flower stall was named Dona Irace, that the honeyman had lost half his hives in a frost last year and was recovering, that the thin girl selling milk sweets at the market entrance was the daughter of the municipal schoolteacher and had an absurd talent for mathematics. She was choosing pears when she heard a voice beside her. "Those are the best in the market, but the one at the corner has the ones that came from Christina, and they are even sweeter." She turned around. The man who had spoken was about 40, of medium height, with tanned skin from working outdoors, large calloused hands holding a straw basket with herbs and vegetables inside. He had grey hair at his temples and a thin moustache. What caught Natalia's attention most was none of those things. It was the way he looked at her, without arrogance, without calculation, without the interest she had learned to recognize and deflect in years of corporate life. It was just a direct and calm gaze from someone who had said a simple thing and expected a simple answer. "Thank you," she said. "First time at the market?" he asked. "Second, but the first week I came so early that almost everything was already gone." He gave a short laugh. "Yeah, it's like that here. Those who arrive after 8 get what's left from the lazier ones." "You don't seem lazy." "I wake up at 5 every day." He said this without pride or complaint, just as a fact. "I have a vegetable garden and a stretch of forest that needs care." "Are you a farmer?" "I'm a trail guide, and I maintain a private preservation area. I also plant what I eat." He held out his hand. "Heitor Tavares, Natalia," she shook his hand. "I'm staying at Valeria Drummond's house." "I know Valeria." A smile appeared. "Everyone knows Valeria. She makes the best cornmeal cake in town." "She does," Natalia agreed, and realized she was smiling too, and that it hadn't cost any effort. The conversation ended there, without drama. He moved on to the next stand. She walked to the corner stall and bought the sweetest pears she had eaten in years, but when she returned home and placed the fruit on the kitchen table, she stood still for a few seconds, thinking about that man with calloused hands and a calm gaze. It was nothing. It was just a man at a market. But there was something in the simplicity of that encounter that contrasted so strongly with everything her life had been in recent years that it remained engraved in a way she didn't expect. That afternoon, by phone, she received a message from her lawyer confirming that the divorce documents had been received by the other party. The process was taking its course. She read the message, replied with a yes, put the phone in the nightstand drawer, and went out to help Valeria water the garden. There was a life happening. A small, slow life, smelling of wet earth and ginger. And it was, surprisingly, enough. July brought the frosts. In the early morning, the grass turned white with crystals, and breath came out of the mouth like thin smoke. Natalia woke up early now, not because she had to, but because the silence of 5 in the morning in Gonçalves had a different quality than any silence she had experienced before. It was a full silence, of distant birds, of the wind among the eucalyptus trees on the slope, of the wood stove that Valeria lit before the sun. She was almost 4 months along. The belly had arrived for good, discreet but undeniable when she looked at herself in the bathroom mirror while changing clothes. She ran her hands over it that morning with a mixture of feelings she could no longer separate, fear, wonder, and something that was starting to look frighteningly like joy. The doctor in Gonçalves was a white-haired gentleman named Dr. Edmer, who practiced in a small room behind the pharmacy and had photos on the wall of at least 40 years of births performed in that region. Valeria took her to the first appointment without being asked, sat in the chair next to her and held Natalia's hand while the ultrasound showed the heart pulsing on the small screen. The equipment was old compared to what she had used in São Paulo, but Dr. Edmer handled that probe with the security of someone who had seen more life than most modern machines. There was a photo in a gold frame on his desk, 4 generations of the same family he had followed since the great-grandfather. That said more about who Dr. Edmer was than any diploma on the wall. "Strong," Dr. Edmer said with satisfaction. "This one is in a hurry to live." Natalia looked at the screen for a long time. That fast and perfect pulse was the most real thing she had seen in months. On the way back home, Valeria asked carefully, "Does the father know?" "No." "Are you going to tell him?" Natalia took a while to answer. She observed the dirt road, the houses with their vegetable gardens in the backyards, a child running after a chicken in someone's yard. "I don't know yet," she said finally. "But I know this child is mine, and I'm not going to use them as a bargaining chip." Valeria nodded once, slowly. "That is wisdom, my daughter." It was that week that Heitor Tavares reappeared. She was in Valeria's garden trying without much success to understand the difference between basil and wild basil when he passed by the dirt road with a hoe on his shoulder and stopped seeing the confusion in the flower bed. "You're pulling out the rosemary thinking it's a weed," he said without judgment in his tone. Natalia looked at her hand. "Indeed. I have zero talent for this." "Nobody is born knowing." He leaned the hoe against the wall, entered the garden without being called, and began to show with patience how to identify each plant by its smell and the shape of its leaf. They had a way of speaking together that was too easy to be casual. He explained things of the natural world with a clarity that wasn't condescension. It was just someone who loved what he knew and had no problem sharing it. She really paid attention, not because she needed to learn about herbs, but because she wanted to keep hearing that calm voice. That afternoon in the garden lasted longer than Natalia had planned. He showed how mint spread if not contained, how thyme needed direct sun and drainage, how the roots of certain plants could heal the soil around them just by existing. There was a patience in him that wasn't resignation, it was love for what he did. And Natalia, who had spent years in a world where everything was speed and results, found in that afternoon something she didn't know she had lost, the pleasure of learning something completely useless for a career and completely essential for life. When Valeria appeared at the kitchen window calling for lunch, Heitor said goodbye with a wave and left with the hoe on his shoulder. Valeria looked at her niece with a smile that said nothing and said everything. "Don't say it," Natalia said. "I didn't say anything," Valeria replied. August arrived, and with it a timid heat that softened the mornings. Natalia had started working remotely, a legal consulting project that an old colleague had passed to her, sufficient to maintain some financial independence without having to step into a big city. She worked a few hours in the morning and spent her afternoons free. It was in those afternoons that Heitor began to appear more frequently. There was no formal invitation. Things happened organically. He would pass by the street and see her sitting on the garden bench with a book and ask if she wanted to see a short trail to a lookout point that was a 20-minute walk away. She would say yes. They would go. They would return with lungs full of cold air and a comfortable silence between them. He never asked what had brought her to Gonsov's. She never explained. But one afternoon in August, while they were coming down the trail from the lookout and she needed to hold his arm on a slippery stretch, he looked at the belly that the bulky coat no longer hid, and then looked at her and said nothing. He just held her arm more firmly until they reached the flat path. That silence communicated more than a whole conversation could. That night at Valeria's table, with hot soup and bread toasted on the embers, Natalia finally told the story. Not all of it, but enough. The marriage that had ended, the betrayal, leaving São Paulo, the child who would come without the father knowing. Valeria already knew most of it, but saying it out loud to herself as much as to the other was different. "Are you afraid he will show up?" Valeria asked. "I'm afraid that when he shows up, he will try to turn this into a negotiation," Natalia said. "He treats everything like a negotiation." "And do you think he will show up?" She thought of Rodrigo's face when she had said, "All right," and left the room, of the ring on the bed, of the untouched envelope. Rodrigo Cavalcanti was not used to silence, and her silence, she knew, must be bothering him. "Yes," Natalia said. "Eventually he will show up." But that night that seemed distant. The soup was good. The fire crackled in the wood stove, and outside the mountain range was blue and cold under the stars. She placed her hands over her belly under the table, felt the quiet pulse of that small life growing, and left the worry for later. There was time. Here in this town that smelled of wet earth and cornbread, there was time. And while that time existed, she intended to learn to use it well. September arrived with spring. The slopes of the Gonçalves Mountains exploded in green and wildflowers, took over the dirt paths, as if the whole mountain had decided at once to recompose itself. Natalia was 6 months along, and her belly was now an undeniable presence, which she had learned to carry with a dignity that surprised even herself. Dr. Edmer was satisfied with the development. "A girl," he had said at the last appointment with his 70-year-old smile. "This baby is as healthy as the mountain range." A girl. Natalia stayed with that for days, testing the word, feeling its weight and lightness at the same time. A girl. She hadn't thought of a name yet, but there was a new serenity in knowing, as if the mystery had diminished a bit, and in its place something more solid had entered. Heitor found out the sex of the baby, without her having planned to tell him. They were on one of their afternoon trails, this time on a gentler path she could do without getting too tired, when she stopped to rest on a flat rock and said, looking at the valley below, "It's a girl." He was beside her, looking at the same valley. He was silent for a moment, then said, "Do you have a name yet?" "Not yet." "There's time." A pause. "My mother was named Clara." She looked at him. There was no subtext in his speech, no disguised suggestion. It was just a man who had shared something small and true, the way he did everything, without calculation, without intention to impress. "Clara is beautiful," she said. "It is," he agreed. And they sat there on the rock for a long time, looking at the green valley and the low clouds rolling down the slope, needing nothing more than that. There was a specific quality in that silence that Natalia spent the following days trying to name. It wasn't an absence of conversation. It was the presence of someone who didn't need to fill every pause with words, who understood that sometimes the most important thing two people can do together is simply exist in the same place, looking at the same thing without demanding that the other continuously confirm they are there. It was the silence of someone who trusts, and she had forgotten what that sounded like. The relationship between the two had grown like the plants in Valeria's garden, without haste, without announcement, in a way that only became visible when you stepped back and looked from afar. There were no declarations, no exaggerated romantic gestures. There was presence. Heitor appeared when she needed help carrying something heavy. He appeared with a basket of fruit from the market on days when she was too tired to go out. He appeared with stories of the mountain range, of the animals he found on the trails, of the families he guided through the forest, and who sometimes moved him more than they knew. He was a man who had chosen to live simply not for lack of an alternative, but out of conviction. Natalia understood this gradually, through conversations that stretched beyond the time she had planned to return home. Heitor had lived in Belo Horizonte for about 10 years, worked in logistics, had a perfectly functional urban life, but he had returned to Gonçalves, where he was born, when his father got sick, and when his father passed away, he simply stayed. The town had received him back without questions. It was as if the mountain knew he belonged to it, and had just waited with the patience that only nature has. He resumed the paths he had walked since he was a boy, learned to guide others through them, and discovered that transmitting that landscape to those who had never seen it was a way of receiving it again for the first time, seen through the eyes of others. "No longing?" she asked once. "For what?" "For the city. For the speed." He thought seriously before answering. "Sometimes I miss certain things. Cinema, a good restaurant, that energy of a full subway that you find strange when it's gone." He gave a smile. "But speed itself, no. I learned that speed is not the same as progress." Natalia kept that sentence. It was simple, but there was a truth in it that she had taken years to discover in the most painful way possible. At the end of September, Valeria fell ill. Nothing serious, but a flu that left her in bed for almost a week, coughing and grumbling that she was fine when she clearly wasn't. Natalia took over the house without discussion. She cooked, washed, made tea, got medicine from the pharmacy. When she wasn't with Valeria, Heitor appeared to help with whatever was needed in the garden or with the shopping. One afternoon, when Valeria was sleeping and the two were in the kitchen waiting for the soup to boil, sitting on opposite sides of the table with coffee cups between their hands, Heitor said, "You are well here." It wasn't a question. "I am," she said, and realized it was true in a way that didn't need explanation. "It scares me a little." "Why?" "Because I didn't plan this. I came here without any plan, and I just stayed." She looked at the window where the mountain could be seen back there, green and quiet. "In my old life, I never did anything without a plan." "And how was that life with a plan?" She gave a short laugh. "You saw how it turned out." He nodded, without smiling this time. "Sometimes the best plans are the ones we don't make." She kept looking at him for a moment longer than she intended. He didn't look away. "Heitor," she said slowly, "you never asked me about her father." "It's none of my business." "But you must be curious." "I am," he admitted, "but I learned that people tell things when they are ready, and that asking before that is pushing someone into a story that hasn't ended yet." Natalia was silent. The stove bubbled. Outside, a cold wind made the garden leaves whisper. "He doesn't know I'm pregnant," she said finally. "When he asked for the divorce, I already knew, but I didn't say anything." "Why?" "Because I didn't want him to stay out of pity or out of obligation." She looked up. "Or because a lawyer said it was better." Heitor was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "That was courageous. Or it was stupidity. Sometimes they are the same thing." He stood up to stir the soup. "What are you going to do when he finds out?" "He will find out eventually. And when that happens, I'll have to be very firm in who I am now, not who I was when I left São Paulo." Heitor tasted the soup, adjusted the seasoning, put the spoon on the rest. He turned to her with that calm gaze she had learned to recognize as his most sincere way of paying attention. "You are no longer the same as when you arrived," he said. "That much is visible." And Natalia knew he was right, because she saw it too. October came with generous rains and nights cooling down again before summer arrived for good. Natalia was 7 months along and had stopped using loose coats as a disguise. Her belly was large and round, and she had reached a peace with it that still surprised her. When she walked through the Gonçalves Square, the women of the town greeted her with that specific affection reserved for pregnant women, a hand on the shoulder, a wide smile, a comment about how beautiful she looked. She had stopped finding that warmth strange. She had learned to receive it. The divorce process had advanced without her needing to appear in person. Her lawyer, a discreet woman hired before she left São Paulo, took care of everything by email. The assets were few to divide. The apartment was Rodrigo's, her savings were hers. There was no complicated interwoven partnership. The marriage had been, in that sense, a relatively simple thing to undo on paper. What wasn't simple was the silence. Rodrigo had tried to call in the first 2 months. She hadn't answered. He had sent messages that she read without replying. In the 3rd month, the messages became sparser, then stopped. She interpreted that as the end of the effort and moved on. But in mid-October, her lawyer called her by video conference with a slightly cautious tone. "Natalia, I need to inform you that the opposing party has requested direct contact. Rodrigo Cavalcanti wants to talk to you." She was silent for a moment. "About what?" He didn't specify, but he mentioned that he heard about new circumstances. Natalia closed her eyes. Someone had spoken, a mutual friend, an acquaintance, the São Paulo network that was large, but never as large as it seemed. She knew that day would come. "Say that I'm fine and that the process follows normally," she said, "and that any communication should go through the legal channel." The lawyer nodded. Understood. But Natalia knew that wasn't the end. She knew Rodrigo. The man who had presented divorce papers as if it were a corporate meeting was not the type to accept not having control over a situation, especially when the situation involved something he could claim. She told Heitor that afternoon, on the garden bench where the two had the habit of sitting at the end of the day, when the sun began to turn the slope golden. Not because she needed advice, but because she had grown accustomed to not keeping things to herself, and that still surprised her. "He's going to come," she said. "I don't know when, but he will." Heitor was silent for a moment. Then, "And when he comes, what do you need?" She thought. "I need to be standing the way I am now, not the way I was when I left São Paulo." "You already are." "You say that as if it were easy to be sure." "It's not easy to be sure," he said with honesty. "But I see you every day. I know the difference." Natalia stood looking at the mountains. The sun was going down behind them, painting the sky in warm tones. Rodrigo Cavalcanti arrived in Gonçalves on a cold Thursday afternoon, driving a black SUV that clashed completely with the town's dirt streets. Natalia saw him through the living room window before he knocked at the door. She stood still for a moment, with her hand on her belly, breathing. He was parked on the dirt road, looking at the house as if trying to understand how that place existed. There was something almost comical in it. The man in a beige suit and a 70,000 real car, standing before a brick house with a messy garden, and an orange cat looking at him from the window with total indifference. In that contrast, Natalia saw with a clarity she hadn't had in 5 years of marriage everything that had been wrong between them. She had tried for a long time to fit into a world that was his world, and had lost herself in the process. Valeria appeared beside her without making a sound, looked through the window and said only, "Do you want me to stay?" "No, but don't go too far." She opened the door herself. Rodrigo was different. Not physically, he was always well presented, his beige travel suit impeccable even after hours on the road. But there was something in his face she hadn't seen before, a disorientation he tried to disguise with his usual posture. He looked at her, at the belly, back to her face. "Natalia," he said, and there was something hesitant in his voice. "Rodrigo." She opened the door wider. "Come in." Valeria's living room was exactly the opposite of the office where he had handed her the divorce papers. Handmade crafts on the walls, crochet quilts over the old leather sofa, a pile of books on the coffee table. Rodrigo sat on the edge of the sofa, as if afraid of wrinkling something. "Why did you disappear?" he began. "I didn't disappear. You found out where I am. It took me months to find out, because I didn't want you to know before." He looked at the belly again. There was an expression on his face that she read with precision. It wasn't love or regret. It was the expression of someone who realized they had lost control of a variable. "Why didn't you tell me?" "When I found out you were handing me divorce papers," she said, with a calmness that surprised even her. "It didn't seem like the moment. Natalia, this changes everything. For you, maybe. For me, no." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "She is my daughter." "She is. I have rights." "You do." She didn't look away. "And they will be discussed through my lawyer, within the legal process, like every issue between us from now on." Rodrigo was silent. That clearly wasn't the script he had planned for the conversation. He was used to leading, to defining terms, to closing deals. "I made a mistake," he said finally, lower. "Several," she replied without cruelty. "But this isn't a conversation about mistakes, Rodrigo. This conversation doesn't happen here, in this way, now. Are you with someone?" The question came out in a way she recognized. It wasn't jealousy. It was territory verification. She didn't answer immediately. She thought of Heitor on the garden bench, the calm gaze, the calloused hands, the conversations that cost nothing and were worth everything. "What I have or don't have in my private life is none of your business." He was silent for a long moment. Then he stood up slowly, straightened his jacket, looked around Valeria's living room as if trying to understand how she had ended up here. "You were always very proud. You confuse pride with dignity," she said. "They are different things." Rodrigo walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the knob and looked at her over his shoulder. "Can I contact your lawyer?" "That is exactly what I expect you to do." He nodded once, slowly, and left. Natalia stood in the middle of the living room, listening to the black SUV's engine start and pull away down the dirt road. When the sound faded completely, she placed both hands over her belly and took a deep breath. Valeria appeared at the kitchen door with 2 cups of tea. "Fennel tea," she said, to calm down. Natalia took the cup, went to the sofa and sat. Her belly was quiet. The town was quiet. The mountain outside was absolutely quiet. She had remained standing in the way she needed to. After Rodrigo left, something changed in Natalia, not in the dramatic way she had feared for weeks. It changed like a season changes, gradual, almost invisible day to day, but undeniable when you looked back and compared. She had faced what she feared most and come out whole, more than whole. She had come out firmer than she had entered. The child inside her seemed to feel it too. In the days following Rodrigo's visit, the baby's movements became more lively, small and decided kicks that she interpreted with the irrational affection that only a mother can have for a purely biological phenomenon. Clara, as she had begun to call her mentally, was in a hurry. Heitor found out about the visit that same night. She met him in the square by chance, when she went to get some medicine Valeria had asked for, and told him everything on a bench next to the bandstand, while the square lights came on one by one with the arrival of night. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was silent for a moment. "You stood your ground." "I did. I knew you would." She looked at him. "How could you know?" "I didn't know, because I saw you arrive here," he said, "and I saw how you changed. A person who changes like that inside doesn't give in when it matters." Natalia looked at him for a time that would be uncomfortable with anyone else. With Heitor, it wasn't. It was just the time it took for things to settle. "You are a good person, Heitor Tavares," she said finally. He gave one of his short, low laughs. "I'm not extraordinary. I just pay attention. That is rarer than you imagine." They walked back to Valeria's house side by side in the cold of the night. At the corner before the dirt road, he stopped. "Natalia." His voice was more hesitant than usual. "I don't know how things will develop. I don't know what you plan for after the baby is born. If you're going to stay here, if you're going back to São Paulo, if you're going to do something else completely different." He paused. "But I want you to know that what happened between us in these months, the conversations, the trails, all of it, was real to me. It wasn't obligation or convenience." She stayed very quiet. "I know your life is in a complicated moment," he continued. "And I'm not asking for anything. I'm just saying that when things settle and when you know what you want, I would like to continue being part of it, in whatever way makes sense to you." The yellow street lamp on the corner illuminated them from the side, and there was an expression on Heitor's face she had seen few times, the deliberate vulnerability of someone who decided to say a true thing, knowing the answer could be anything. It was the most discreet courage in the world, the kind that doesn't need an audience or a dramatic gesture. Just honesty. Natalia looked at him in the yellow light of the lamp. She thought about how she had arrived in Gonçalves broken inside and full of secrets. She thought about how he had never demanded her stories, only waited. She thought about how different it was to be with someone who didn't try to fit you into a role. "I don't know what I want yet," she said, honest, "but I know you are an important part of how I became what I am now, and that isn't going away." He nodded once. He was satisfied with that. It was who he was, someone who knew how to wait without demanding other people's time. Meanwhile, in São Paulo, Rodrigo had returned to his life with an agitation that those around him noticed but didn't comment on. The relationship that had been the reason for the divorce had revealed itself to be smaller than the shine it seemed to have from a distance. The other woman was interesting, but she wasn't Natalia. She didn't have that sharp calmness of Natalia, that ability to be hurt and not show it until the moment she chose to show it, which was always the right moment and never the expected moment. He had hired a second lawyer to follow the paternity recognition process, following the legal channels as she had requested. But every day he woke up thinking about her face in Valeria's living room, the round belly, the eyes that no longer had anything pleading in them. Only firmness. There was a woman in Gonçalves whom he had abandoned for a crisis that in retrospect seemed absurdly small. And that woman had built something without him, without needing him, and that bothered him in a way that took weeks to name as what it really was. Remorse, not for the baby, for what he had wasted. There were nights when he stayed in the large, silent São Paulo apartment, looking at the city below, and thought about that living room of Valeria's, with the crafts on the walls and the crochet quilts on the sofa. There was something in that place that had disturbed him more than he admitted. The evidence that a life completely different from the one he had built was not only possible, but was happening, there, without luxury and without speed, and it seemed much more whole than anything he knew. In November, Natalia received a formal letter from Rodrigo's lawyer proposing a paternity and joint custody agreement that was more reasonable than she had expected. She read it carefully, made her notes, sent it to her lawyer with specific comments. The process continued. It was bureaucratic and sometimes tiring, but it was fair, and it was all she had asked for, that it be through the right channels. What came along with the formal letter, however, was a separate handwritten envelope, with just one line, in the handwriting she recognized from 5 years of notes and messages. "I'm sorry, not for the process, for what I said before, that it should be fast and without drama. You deserved more than that, more. She looked at the line for a long time. Then she put the envelope in the drawer. She didn't throw it away, not because she was going to use it for anything, but because it was the first honest moment he had had with her, and that deserved at least not to be discarded. That night, Valeria made cornmeal cake. The two sat at the table with thick slices and strong black coffee, and Natalia told her about the letter. "Do you believe him?" Valeria asked. "I believe he is being sincere now," she said carefully. "I don't know if the motivations are all clean, but the sentence itself, I think it's true." "And does that change anything?" Natalia thought. "It changes the texture of the past, but it doesn't change the present." Valeria drank her coffee. "You've grown a lot, my daughter. This town helped me. This town and other things." The old woman gave a smile with a hint of mischief. "Valeria." I'm quiet. Natalia laughed. That laugh she had found again in Gonçalves, wide, without calculation, completely different from the contained smiles she had practiced for years in meeting rooms and corporate dinners. Outside, the Gonçalves night was quiet and very starry. The mountain was a dark shape against the sky that didn't even seem real. Natalia placed her hand on her belly and felt Clara move, a long and decided kick. "I know," she said softly. "We've already won the hard part." December arrived with the mountain summer. Hot, open days, nights that still had a freshness São Paulo never had, and the flowers in Valeria's garden in full explosion of color. Natalia was 8.5 months along and had stopped making plans too far ahead. She had learned that pregnancy had its own schedule, and that faking control over it was an elegant way to waste energy. The back room of Valeria's house had been silently transformed. An old dresser, painted white now, had drawers lined with floral paper. A small hammock was fastened between two hooks on the wall, and in the corner, folded over the rocking chair that Heiter had fixed on a Saturday afternoon without anyone asking, was the crochet quilt that Valeria had made over the last 2 months, in the tones she called mountain dawn color. White, beige, a very soft pink. Natalia had spent a lot of time in that rocking chair. It was there, she thought, where she organized what that impossible year had been, where she looked at the white shoes with satin bows she had carried since São Paulo, and which were now on the dresser like a talisman. On one of those afternoons, Heitor appeared on the porch with a wooden box he had made with his own hands, a small cedar chest with the name Clara carved on the lid, the letters simple and clean, the kind of thing that lasts decades. He placed it on the dresser next to the little shoes without saying much. He just looked at Natalia in the rocking chair and said, "To keep her first things." She looked at the chest for a while. Then she said, "Heitor, why do you do this?" "Do what?" "Show up, without me asking, without me promising anything." He leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed, thinking with that seriousness she had learned to recognize as his way of respecting a question. "Because you deserve someone who shows up," he said finally. "And because I want to show up, it's not more complicated than that." Natalia was silent. Then, "I'm starting to understand that it isn't." That was the most she could say at that moment, and he knew it, and he was fine with it. But it was here that the story kept its deepest secret, the one she hadn't told anyone yet. Not Valeria, not Heitor, not her lawyer. A secret that wasn't shameful or tragic, but that she had kept because she still didn't completely understand what it meant. When she was 18, before college, before São Paulo, before Rodrigo, Natalia had been pregnant once. A pregnancy she had lost early, in a boarding house room in Campinas, alone, without anyone knowing. It had been devastating in a way she had buried so deep that for years she believed she had overcome it completely. But in that time in Gonçalves, in the rocking chair, with her hands on Clara's belly, that memory had returned, not with cruelty, but with a new meaning. As if that old loss were part of the path that had led her here. As if everything that had seemed like destruction over the years had been, in fact, preparation. She wasn't ready to tell anyone that yet, but she was ready to carry it without the weight from before. There was something liberating in realizing that certain things don't need to be told to be resolved, that the healing of some wounds happens in silence, in the moments when you look at what you have now and understand that the path that seemed wrong was, in fact, the only one possible. Natalia didn't forgive the past in the sense of erasing it. She incorporated it, let it be part of what had made her who she was, and moved on with it as if it were ballast, not an anchor. In mid-December, Rodrigo called her directly for the first time in months. She answered because her lawyer had warned that he would ask for it. The conversation was short and different from the ones she had imagined, without arrogance, without negotiation, just the tired voice of a man who wanted to know if she was okay. "I'm okay," she said. "I heard you're in Gonçalves, a small town in the south of Minas." "Yes. It seems very far from your life." "It seems so, but it isn't." A pause. "It's much closer than anything I had before." He was silent. Then, "The agreement my lawyer sent. Do you have any objection?" "Some small ones. My lawyer will be in touch." "All right." Another pause, a long one. "Natalia, about what I wrote in the letter—" "You don't need to elaborate," she said, not with coldness, but with gentle firmness. "I received it. I understood. It doesn't change the path, but I understood." "So, okay." His voice was low. "Take care of yourself." "I will." And that was it. The call ended without drama, without tears, without recriminations, exactly as she had needed it to be. It was in that same week that something happened she hadn't planned, and that reorganized everything that was still in suspension. Heitor invited her for a short walk to a different lookout point than the ones they had already been to, further away, but accessible for her as long as she went slowly. She agreed. It was late afternoon and the sun was golden and horizontal, that December light that transforms everything into a photography set. They stopped at the lookout when the sun was almost on the horizon. The mountain range stretched in layers of green and blue that got lighter as they moved away. No city visible, no buildings, just mountain upon mountain as far as the eye could see. "There's something I want to tell you," Heitor said. She looked at him, surprised by the slightly different tone than usual. He stood looking at the valley before speaking. "When I came back to Gonçalves after years away, I thought I was running away. Everyone around me thought I was running away. From the city, from the failure of relationships that didn't work out, from the feeling that urban life wasn't for me." He paused. "It took me about 2 years to understand I wasn't running away from anything. I was coming towards something." She waited. "And when you appeared at the market that day in June, choosing the wrong pair," a brief smile, "I didn't know what that was, but I knew it was something." Natalia stayed very quiet. "I'm not asking you for anything you can't give," he said. "I'm not asking you to stay in Gonçalves if it's not what you want. I'm not asking for any promises ahead of time. But I'm asking you not to close a door that I think we both know exists." The sun disappeared behind the furthest mountain. The sky turned purple and orange at the same time. Below them, the mountain range grew quiet, in a way only nature can achieve. A silence that isn't an absence of sound, but the presence of something much larger. Natalia placed her hand on her belly. Clara gave a gentle kick, and she understood, there at that late afternoon lookout, that that impossible year had been exactly what it needed to be. "I won't close it," she said, simple as he spoke, true as he was. And that was enough. The early hours of December 18th arrived cold and starry, like all early hours in Gonçalves at that time of year. Natalia woke up with a pain that was different from anything she had felt before. Not sharp, not emergency, but insistent and rhythmic, as if her body itself were marking a beat. She lay for a few minutes monitoring the rhythm as Dr. Edmar had taught. Then she got up, put on her robe and went to Valeria's room. The old woman woke up before she knocked on the door. It seemed she had spent the entire pregnancy in a state of light vigil for exactly this moment. She got up, put on her slippers, placed her hand on Natalia's forehead as if measuring her temperature, and said with all the calmness in the world, "Let's get the bag we prepared and call Dr. Edmar." Natalia gave a laugh that came out as a tense breath. "You're doing great, aren't you?" "One of us needs to be." Valeria was already opening the closet. "Where did you put the bag?" "Under the bed." While Valeria called Dr. Edmar, Natalia stood at the bedroom window looking at the dark dirt road below. A few stars. The shape of the mountain against the sky, which was that very dark blue from before dawn. A cat strolling peacefully down the middle of the street. Gonçalves slept, and in a short time, she thought, someone who hadn't yet arrived in the world was going to change all that forever. Dr. Edmar appeared in 20 minutes, by car, with his bag, and that smile of someone who has done this so many times. He knows how to distinguish real urgency from the urgency of anxiety. He examined Natalia in the living room, confirmed she was well and that there was time, and suggested they go to the small hospital in the neighboring town, Venceslau Braz, where he practiced regularly. On the way to the car, Natalia asked Valeria to send a message to Heitor, not because she needed him there, but because there was something she wanted him to know when he woke up. Valeria sent the message without comment. The hospital was small and clean, with nurses who knew Dr. Edmar by his first name, and a small-town calmness that was completely different from the technical and fluorescent agitation of the large São Paulo hospitals Natalia had frequented professionally in other contexts. Here there was silence and competence at the same time, and she let herself be led with a confidence she had never managed in larger places. The hours that followed were long and short at the same time. Pain that came in waves, with intervals where she breathed deeply and thought of small and concrete things. The smell of the rosemary from Valeria's garden, the sound of the wood stove, the cedar chest with the carved name, the little shoes with satin bows on the dresser. There was a moment, at some point around 3 in the morning, when the pain was intense enough to erase everything that wasn't the absolute present. And Natalia discovered that wasn't just suffering. It was clarity. The mind that spent years planning, anticipating, protecting itself became completely quiet, leaving only what was real. The body that knew what to do, the nurse who held her hand, the mountain outside in the darkness, and that insistent life that wanted to arrive. Valeria stayed outside, but came in every time Natalia asked, and left every time Natalia needed silence. It was this exact balance that had made that white-haired woman in a floral apron one of the most important people in Natalia's life in a matter of months. Dr. Edmar was calm. "It's going well," he said from time to time. "This baby knows what it's doing." At dawn, with the sky turning that light purple that precedes the sun, Clara was born. Natalia heard the cry before she saw her. A strong, indignant, and absolutely alive cry that filled the small room in a way disproportionate to the size of the creature producing it. Dr. Edmar did what needed to be done with quiet efficiency. The nurses moved with that silent choreography of those who do it with love, and then they placed Clara on Natalia's chest. The child was red and furious and perfect. Natalia stood looking at her without being able to speak. She had planned to be practical at this moment, rational, the woman who had managed an entire pregnancy with legal precision. But when that warm and small weight landed on her, everything she had planned disappeared completely. She cried. She cried in a way she hadn't been able to cry at any other moment of that year, without control, without calculation, without worrying about what it would look like. She cried for the betrayal that had broken her in the glass office. She cried for the night she had left the ring on the bed. She cried for the loneliness of the taxi towards the bus station. She cried for a very old loss from when she was 18 in a boarding house room in Campinas. She cried for everything that had been difficult and for everything that had become possible. And when the tears diminished, what remained was just this: her, Clara. The dawn coming through the window of the small hospital. The life that had insisted on happening. There was something deeply simple in that moment that she hadn't expected. She expected complexity, dramatic revelation, the feeling that everything had changed at once. What came was different. A quiet certainty, like when you finally find the object you've been looking for hours and realize it was in the most obvious place in the world. It was as if part of her had always known she would arrive here, that furious and perfect baby had been on her way long before any decision she had made or failed to make. Valeria entered later and stood at the door for a moment, looking at the two of them. She didn't say anything, but her eyes said everything. Hours later, when Natalia was rested and Clara slept wrapped in the crib beside her, a message arrived on her phone. It was from Heitor. "So glad you both are well. When you want a visit, just say the word." She smiled reading the message. That was Heitor. Present without invading, available without demanding. the most honest version she had found of how one person could care for another. She replied, "Tomorrow." And she closed her eyes with that word pulsing inside her like a small and sufficient promise. Tomorrow. Outside, Gonçalves woke up slowly. A rooster crowed. The sun came up behind the mountain and tinted the sky orange and gold, that same color of the sunset in the glass office where everything had begun to crumble. But this time, the color didn't suffocate. This time, it was just beautiful. 6 months after Clara's birth, Gonçalves had a new rhythm. Not different from the previous one, the same dirt streets, the same square with the stone church, the same smell of coffee and jasmine that woke the town every morning. But there was a new detail. The sound of a wooden rattle coming from the porch of Valeria Drummond's house on sunny afternoons, and a small hammock hung between 2 pillars where a dark-eyed child observed the world with the specific seriousness of someone who is still learning what a leaf is, what wind is, what that golden thing is that appears in the sky every morning. Clara Asunção had arrived in the world in a hurry and stayed with the calmness her mother had learned. She had Rodrigo's dark eyes, but her way of observing things was completely her own. A curious seriousness, an attention to the minute details of the world that made any adult near her feel they were being studied with affection. Valeria said she was old inside. Dr. Edmar said it was intelligence. Heitor said she reminded him of the forest birds, which stay completely quiet before moving with absolute precision. Natalia now worked 3 hours a morning. The legal consulting projects she had expanded little by little to include clients from towns in the region who needed specialized guidance without having to travel to capitals. She had discovered that her São Paulo training and experience had much more application in a country context than she had imagined. And she had discovered, more importantly, that working like this with autonomy and purpose, without the pressure of corporate hierarchies and vanity meetings, was the kind of professional life she had wanted without knowing how to name it. There was a specific satisfaction in solving a real problem for a real person who sought her out by name. In a town where she was known. In São Paulo, she had been a part of an enormous, competent, and replaceable machine. Here, she was a person who knew things other people needed to know, and that difference, small on paper, was enormous in daily experience. She had reached the conclusion, late but firm, that prestige and relevance are not the same thing. The agreement with Rodrigo had been finalized in March. Paternity recognized, custody defined with common sense. Clara would spend agreed periods with him as she grew and circumstances evolved. Rodrigo had accepted the terms without drama, and in their meetings to deal with practical matters, there was a civility Natalia didn't expect but received with gratitude. He had seen Clara once, on an afternoon organized with care by the lawyers of both parties, and had stood in a long silence looking at his daughter. He didn't say anything grand, but there was something in his face that was genuine, and she chose to believe in that. There was no reconciliation. There was no friendship. There were 2 adults who had once loved each other and now shared a responsibility with the minimum of friction possible. It was less than what romances promise and much more than most stories deliver. Natalia had learned throughout that impossible year that ending a story with dignity doesn't mean it didn't hurt. It means you chose, at the point where you had to choose, not to let the pain decide for you. Rodrigo had been an important part of who she was. He wouldn't be erased, but he had stayed where he belonged, in the past that had shaped her, not in the present she had built. Heitor Tavares had a key to Valeria's house since April. There was no ceremony for it. There was no formal request. There was just an afternoon when he arrived, and Valeria said, while serving coffee, "The spare key is on the hook at the entrance. You can take yours." And he said thanks and took it, and that was all. That was how things worked between people who had learned not to complicate what was already simple. There was a specific beauty in that which Natalia recognized now in a way she couldn't have recognized a year before. The beauty of the absence of performance. There was nothing to prove in that house, no role to sustain, no expectations to manage. There were just people who liked each other and found daily ways to show it without needing an audience. He continued guiding trails. He continued in the vegetable garden. He continued showing up with fruit from the market and stories of the forest. And he had added a new skill to the routine, that no one had asked for, but everyone appreciated. He was capable of rocking Clara to sleep in approximately 3 minutes, a record Valeria had timed with the kitchen clock and announced with disproportionate pride. On a June afternoon, almost exactly a year since that first conversation at the market about pears and the corner stall, Natalia and Heitor were sitting on the garden bench with Clara between them, awake and curious, holding a sprig of rosemary with the seriousness of someone conducting a scientific experiment. The sun was at that lazy late afternoon angle that made everything golden, the flowers in Valeria's garden open and noisy with bees, and there was in the air that mixed smell of earth and rosemary and coffee that Natalia had learned to associate with the feeling of being in the right place. "Have you been thinking about São Paulo?" Heitor asked. It was a question he had never asked directly. Natalia knew why. He didn't want her to answer based on what she thought he wanted to hear. She thought seriously before answering. "I think about it sometimes," she said, "as a place that existed, as someone I was." She paused. "But I don't miss the life I had there. I miss certain things. A good cinema, some restaurants, the energy once in a while." She looked at Clara moving the sprig of rosemary with all the concentration in the world. "But it's not the city I miss. It's moments, and those moments I can have in other places, including here." "Including here?" Heitor was silent for a moment. Then, "I asked because I received an invitation to lead an ecological tourism project in a mountain range in Espírito Santo. 2 months of work. It would be good financially, but it would take me away from here for that time." He looked at her sideways. "And I don't want to make that decision without talking to you first." Natalia stood looking at him. That was new, not because he had asked for permission, but because he had naturally recognized that there was a shared life that deserved to be considered. "You should go," she said. "It's a job that makes sense for you." "And you?" "I have Valeria. I have my work. I have this child who is going to start crawling any day and is going to pull everything down." She smiled. "I'll be fine." "I know you'll be fine," he said. "But I'm going to miss you." "Me too," she said. And it was true, without drama and without shock. It was just true. Valeria appeared at the kitchen door at that moment, with a dishcloth on her shoulder and an expression of someone who had been listening to everything for a long time and pretended she wasn't. It was her being natural, present without needing to announce it, attentive without being invasive, part of that new world with the firmness of the old trees that exist before you arrive and continue after you go. "The cornmeal cake is ready," she said. "Whoever is having an important conversation can continue after coffee." They laughed. Clara waved the rosemary sprig as if she agreed. And that was it. It was like that. Without fanfare, without spectacular last-minute revelation, without the love that knocks everything down and rebuilds in the movies. It was the opposite, with the life that rebuilds little by little, on silent afternoons, in ginger teas, in keys handed over naturally on the hook at the entrance, in a dark-eyed baby looking at the world with the seriousness of someone who has a lot of time ahead, in 2 adults who had learned, through different and equally tortuous paths, that the best way to love someone is not to demand that they be more than they are. Natalia Assunção had arrived in Gonçalves with a suitcase, a secret, and the shards of something she had believed to be her life. She had discovered that shards were raw material, not remnants, that the mountain had space for those who arrived willing to be transformed by it. That silence, when you stopped fearing it, revealed things with a clarity that noise never allowed, and that sometimes the most solid love is not what arrives as a storm. It's what appears as Heitor Tavares at the market on a cold Friday with a straw basket and information about pears and stays, simply stays. That afternoon, while the sun goldened the slopes through the kitchen window, and Valeria cut the cake with the same ceremony she put into everything, Natalia looked around and made a silent inventory of what was in that room. An old woman who had received her without questions and stayed without leaving. A man who had learned that loving someone can simply be showing up when the other person needs and knowing how to step back when they don't. Her dark-eyed daughter, who had arrived in the world certain of herself in a way it would still take years for her mother to completely understand. It was a small life, measured in square meters of garden and kilometers of trail. It was an enormous life, measured in everything that mattered. As the sun once again goldened the mountain slopes and the smell of cornmeal cake took over the whole house, Natalia realized there was nothing else to return to. Because the place where you finally learn to breathe is, by definition, the place where you are at home. If this story touched something in you, if you recognized in a sentence, in a scene, in a silent choice of Natalia's, something that also exists in your life, then you already understand why we do this. Here on the channel, every story we tell is about real people making human choices in impossible moments, about how one leaves, about how one rebuilds, about what is found when we stop running and learn to stay still on a mountain long enough to hear what the silence has to say. If you aren't subscribed yet, this is the moment. Click the red button and join our community. Leave your like if this story stayed with you, and tell us in the comments, have you ever had to leave to find yourself? Your story matters, and we want to read it. Until the next meeting. There was a story she would tell Clara one day, when the girl was old enough to understand, about a ring left on a bed, about satin shoes bought on a São Paulo sidewalk, about a message sent to a woman named Valeria who replied, "You can come, I will leave the light on." About how sometimes what seems like the end is just the first sentence of a much better story.